Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast. This week, we've got money on our minds. Specifically, we're thinking about how cloud technology, microservices and APIs are transforming finance for individuals and businesses alike.
Digital transformation has affected every industry, and banking is no exception. New digital native financial services are making money management easier and more accessible than ever before. And one such challenger is Yolt, a money management app that has recently expanded into contactless cards and current accounts.
Joining us today to discuss the engineering challenges of this move and how new digital technologies have helped solve them is Yolt CTO Roderick Simons. Roderick, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jane. Great to be here.
So, Roderick, listeners may be familiar with the existing version of Yolt. I know I have been a user for some years. It's a kind of very helpful financial management app with a number of smart prediction capabilities, predicting how far your money's going to go, what your expenditure is likely to be in various categories, a lot of kind of clever personal finance stuff like that. But what's new from a technical standpoint compared to the existing version of Yolt?
Yeah, so now we're moving more into the domain of actually having an own current account and doing payments. And I think the biggest differentiator by far is that to some extent we become the source of truth for some of the data. And to give an example, in the past with the Yolt app, if, for example, for whatever reasons the Yolt app would not work, our clients, our customers would still be able to go to their own banking app and see the data to some extent there. So with the current proposition, this is not possible anymore. We become the source of truth. There is different requirements on the resilience and the availability of the systems that you need to impose. And to give one specific example, and that's more on the resilience side. So we work with an event-based system where a lot of messages fly around in the system to instruct other parts of the system to do something. And what's really important is that in payments, if you instruct a system to do a payment, that you make sure that it only does the payment once and not more. And this idempotency is something we've worked quite hard on with the different teams in all kinds of failure analysis to detect, okay, where can we actually implement new controls to make the system more robust.
So when it comes to these new capabilities, the becoming a single source of truth plus the contactless cards, the current accounts, all of that, how long did it take you to develop these new features? Because that must have been an awful lot of work.
Yeah, definitely. And it was also quite challenging because we operate from within 3 different countries. And we also had the COVID pandemic, which forced us to work from home. So quite some challenges to overcome. I think the good thing is we already had a number of components which were available from the first version of Yolt. And it took us eventually around 9 months to deliver and bring this proposition live.
Wow, that's quite impressive. So did you face any particular challenges over the course of the development of these new features? You've mentioned, obviously, the COVID pandemic and having to shift from a presumably office-based environment to working from home. But were there any other challenges on the kind of engineering side?
Yeah, so there are a lot of challenges, and maybe I can stick to 2 or 3. In my view, one of the biggest challenges was around the testing side. There's not really a testing environment end-to-end, which allows us to go to a shop, do a fake payment, and actually see if the systems would behave in the right way, and also to introduce all kinds of failure scenarios, which sometimes, they might never come up, but you need to take them into account in the design anyway. So testing was quite difficult. So in the past within Yolt, engineers were responsible for testing their own code. That's still the case. We didn't have QA engineers that are dedicated to the testing side of Yolt. But with this new proposition, for the first time actually in the history of Yolt, we hired a couple of testing engineers, mainly focusing on creating these stubs, which would allow us to simulate, let's say, fake payments. And to make sure that we can test all the failure scenarios in a good way.
So it sounds like, so you mentioned that engineers at Yolt are responsible for testing their own code. It sounds like you guys are using a kind of DevOps type development structure.
Yeah, that's correct. So if you look at the setup of our team, we on the app side we have what we call a feature team. So that is an iOS, usually two Android engineers and around 4 backend engineers. And this team has the responsibility for a certain part of the application, and they are end-to-end responsible for the delivery, the maintenance, and also they're on call in the case of something going wrong.
Mm.
So do you feel then that using this DevOps structure helped you do all this within the space of 9 months? Because it's quite a startlingly short amount of time.
Yeah, I think it definitely contributed. Let me maybe give a few examples. So I think for Yolt, speed of iteration is really important. So how often can we bring software to production? And in the early days of Yolt, this was actually once every 2 weeks. But over the course of the years, we have matured and we're now capable of doing, let's say, around 50 releases a week
Wow.
on the full Yolt side. So this is really important because then your releases become small. You can go to production in a controllable way and see the effect and also deliver business value in small increments. So this is one of the reasons I do think indeed why we were quite fast. But there's also other reasons, and that's more around the make or buy or build discussion. It's quite a challenge to build a full bank from a full account and card from scratch. So we also leveraged some partners which actually deliver this as a service, so that we could focus on delivering really the value for our users, while the more heavy lifting around managing the card and also the other sides there is being taken care of by a third party.
Mm. Well, it's time for a short break now, but when we come back, we'll be learning more about the third-party partners Yolt relies on and how it uses technology tools to help build out its offering.
See you after the break. Welcome back. So, Roderick, while Yolt came out of ING, it is still effectively a relatively young company. And one of the advantages of that is presumably that you are fairly unencumbered by legacy infrastructure. So what kind of IT tools do you rely on to deliver your services, both the pre-existing ones and the new ones?
Yeah, so indeed, the infrastructure legacy that we have is not there compared to maybe some traditional banks. But what is good to understand is that as a spin-off of ING, you would start most likely in a data center of ING, like ourselves. So we have seen, let's say, 2 iterations of the infrastructure that hosted Jolt. The first one on the ING data center, and the second one on AWS in the cloud.
Mm. And you use a microservices architecture for a lot of your application delivery, right?
Correct. Yeah. So actually, in the early days, when we designed Jolt, we knew that if we would just spin out of ING, then we wanted to have an architecture that would facilitate moving to a cloud quite easily. And this was one of the criteria when deciding on what kind of architecture to use. And also, we knew that we had different capabilities which we would need. So on the one hand side, we had the capability of actually just processing and fetching data and presenting this to our users. But to the other hand side, there is more these services around data enrichment and machine learning, which we had the desire to combine all those in a single environment, and then microservices would prove a good isolation between those domains.
And so, has the way that you use these tools changed at all to accommodate the app's expanded scope?
So in the early days, we started to use Kubernetes for the orchestration, and I believe that back then we started on Kubernetes version 1.3, if I'm not mistaken, and we've seen the evolution of Kubernetes grow, and it has become the standard platform for orchestrating your containerized services, that hasn't changed. We only have matured along the way. What has changed is basically our infra setup. So in the beginning, actually 2 years back we migrated to AWS, and there we changed the way how we manage the infrastructure. In the past, to give you an example, when a machine would have an issue, we would SSH into the machine and we would restart a service or process, and we would nurture that machine back into health. But in our current setup, we treat the infrastructure as being immutable, which basically means when there is an issue, we just spin up a new one, and a couple of minutes later, we kill the old one, and we let the new one join the cluster. So this changes a bit the way on how you do your traditional infrastructure management compared to the past.
Modern IT management is so brutal.
I was going to say, it's quite a ruthless strategy. So, Roderick, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the, let's say, more modern elements of the Yolt service, particularly the AI and machine learning components that you mentioned briefly earlier. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Yolt uses AI and, more importantly, how you've integrated that into the product from a development and engineering standpoint?
Yeah. Definitely. So from an organizational perspective, we have a dedicated data team where we have data engineers and data scientists, or machine learning engineers, as we call them, work closely together, and they own a set of services. So to take an example, the service that delivers us categorization is actually a simple service which gets transactions in and actually provides recommendations, categories, as the outcome. And the data scientists, they look for which tools they can use, the right tool for the right job. And in this case, they use a bit of Python, and they use some machine learning libraries, and they have a trained labeled data set, which they use to train the categorization model. And what's quite important in the Yolt app, our users can give feedback. They say, no, this transaction should belong to groceries, and based on the feedback of the users, we have a pipeline which automatically actually retrains the model on a monthly or weekly basis, depending on the amount of feedback that we get, so that we make sure that we are also always keeping up to date with regards to these models.
Now, personal finance isn't all that you do. Can you tell us a bit more about Yolt Technology Services?
Yeah, definitely. So Yolt Technology Services is actually our second business of Yolt, and it's really focusing on the business-to-business market. And Yolt Technology Services is a provider of open banking services. And to maybe explain a little bit about what open banking is, it's actually the reason why banks need to open up their APIs so that a third party, like the Yolt app, for example, with consent can access the payment data, transactions, and the balances of individuals, but also make a payment initiation. And Yolt Technology Services provides a solution where businesses don't need to connect individually with all these different banks, but they can connect to one single API and actually have them manage all the connections and the work around it, and the businesses can focus on delivering value for their end client.
I'm about to use a word that I hate, but that sounds like quite a turnkey solution. I just hope that our audience can hear how much I hate that phrase. But it does sound like, it does genuinely sound like sort of quite a turnkey solution, especially given how in the EU in particular, open banking, there's been a lot of emphasis on that and the importance of it. So it really sounds like you're kind of facilitating that fairly essential element of modern banking.
Yeah, correct. So we've connected more than hundreds of banks across Europe and in the UK. Over the years, we've seen that managing, maintaining, and updating this is quite time consuming. And to give you an example, in the UK alone, we're currently at version 3.0 of version 3, actually, in terms of major releases, in terms of the API specifications for the banks. So that means that, we had to change already quite a few times. Well, in fact, our API has remained quite stable since then.
So I think both of us are old enough to remember when banking, consumer banking at least, was quite a time-consuming and manual task. You had to actually go down to the bank to make any kind of significant changes to your account. Now, though, it seems like almost all of it can be done digitally. How do you think the growth of the general API ecosystem has enabled B2B fintech services like Yolt?
Yeah, so for Yolt technology services, APIs are reasons of existence. So we consume a lot of APIs on the one hand side, and we provide a single set of APIs on the other side to make it easier for our businesses to connect. I do however, want to make explicit that only providing an API, you don't have a product with only an API. Yeah? So you also need a sandbox, you need documentation, and if you want to make this really a turnkey solution, so you need to develop a portal, a sandbox, and value-added services on top of it to really make it a product.
So, Roderick, Yolt operates, as you've mentioned, across a number of different territories and markets. How have you guys been using technology to approach the question of regulation and compliance?
So I have to admit that I'm not the 100% expert on the regulatory requirements outside of the technical domain, of course. But what I do want to say is that as Yolt, we are operating in, let's say, two markets. That's mainland Europe and that's the UK. And we have to deal with the Dutch regulator, the DNB, but also with the UK regulator, which is the FCA. So that means that so if we talk about the Brexit, for example, that we will still be able to continue operations after the due date of Brexit. But let's not say it hasn't made our lives a lot easier in the past months to accommodate for this change.
What kind of changes have you had to make to accommodate for it?
Yeah, I think a concrete example is that we have to decide, are we going to passport our current license, which is a Dutch DNB license, or are we going to get our own license? And these are discussions which we're having at the moment, and we're working with the regulator on this topic. This is one of the examples.
As Adam alluded to earlier, over the past couple of decades, if that, banking has gone from being something, or retail banking at least, where you need to go into a physical bank to a situation where you can do virtually everything through online banking or more recently apps. So when it comes to the actual infrastructure behind that, is it the cloud? Is that where it's at, or is it worth keeping legacy infrastructure on premise?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. If you look at Yolt, then I think the only way for Yolt and its competitors is to be in a cloud. I think there is not a lot of competitive advantage that you can gain if you are not in a cloud. And the only question is then how to utilize the cloud. The question is, how high in the stack are you going to be? Are you going to consume services on the infrastructure level, or are you going to move more to SaaS or PaaS products, which take a bit of the hard work away in delivering the value? I, however, do think that for more traditional big organizations and banks, you cannot only consume from one infrastructure provider. There needs to be a multi-cloud or multi-data center strategy. And I can perfectly understand that bigger banks adopt a strategy where they actually have parts in the cloud, but also still keep parts on-premise. And depending on the workload or the type of work, they decide which place is the best to go for.
Is that because a lot of the more traditional banks, I'm thinking sort of Barclays is the one that immediately sprang to mind, but there are plenty of others, also have a sort of investment banking wing. So depending on what kind of workload you're running, depending on what arm of your business it is, might depend where you actually put those workloads.
Yeah, definitely. So you see that there is cloud providers which might be better, for example, in the AI and the machine learning space, and there is maybe cloud providers which are better suited for more the office related stuff. So it depends. Indeed, you can select per cloud provider what best suits them, and also keep data maybe a bit locally in your country for some parts where you think it might be too sensitive. Let's take the credentials or your your PIN codes, for example, to keep them more local.
Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for on this week's episode, but our thanks once again to Yolt CTO Roderick Simons for joining us.
Thanks, Adam.
If you want to find out more about any of the topics we've spoken about in this show, just follow the link in the show notes.
We'll be back next week with more IT insight, but until then, you can follow us on social media or sign up to our newsletter for more great content.
See you next week.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.